Good evening. I welcome all the participants to the 7th lecture of webinar series of Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar. And today we are going to explore much further into the Harappan civilization, and we are going to look into the Harappan civilization in Gujarat region. So in this regard, I welcome Professor Ajithprasad from MS University, who has kindly consented to deliver the lecture. And we are really fortunate to have him here. He doesn't need any introduction. His expertise varies in various fields, starting from his doctoral thesis on prehistoric archaeology from MS University, Baroda. And he has worked extensively on the Harappan civilization in Gujarat, as well as on the prehistoric archaeology in the Gujarat region. In particularly, he worked on the prehistory of Gujarat, particularly of the Orsang and the Sabarmati river valleys, and also on the eastern margin of Gujarat. And more recently, he is working in the region of Kachchh area of Gujarat, and his expertise goes back to in the Harappan archaeology goes back to 1980s onwards, and he has contributed a lot looking into various aspects of the Harappan civilization. One of his recent excavations at Shikarpur, it has yielded much valuable insights into the Harappan civilization, and I hope he will be sharing that information as well. And more recently, he is looking into the hunter-gatherer transition and the beginning of agro-pastoral life in the context of early Harappan settlements in northern Gujarat, because many of you might be knowing about the potentialities of northern Gujarat. In that area, MS University has worked a lot in the past, explored a lot of Harappan sites and also agro-pastoral sites there. And I hope today's lecture will be an eye-opener, and we will learn much more about Harappan archaeology in Gujarat from Professor Ajithprasad. Sir, I welcome you again, and I thank you for consider to deliver this lecture. And it's over to you, sir. Please deliver this.
All right. Before I actually start, thanks very much to all of you in the Archaeological Science Center, IIT Gandhinagar, especially to Dr. Prabhakar and all the members of the faculty inviting me for this talk on Indus civilization in Gujarat, Harappan civilization and Indus civilization. I use it actually kind of interchangeable way. What I am actually going to present is about the current perspective, some interesting aspects about the Indus civilization or the Harappan civilization in Gujarat. Before I start, I actually wanted to acknowledge my indebtedness to our fellow researchers. The Indus civilization research in Gujarat. In fact, we are actually in the 100th year of the discovery of Indus civilization. So the research, Indus research in Gujarat actually is almost 80 to 90 years old. The first site outside the Indus Valley was discovered from Gujarat in 1933, soon after the discoveries of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. So I am actually building upon what has been actually kind of studied research for the last 90 years. So thanks to all the fellow researchers, especially the students, those who from different institutions, like not only universities in our own country, but also abroad, and institutions like the Archaeological Survey of India and Gujarat State Archaeology Department. So what I am actually going to present is not essentially my own work, but an overview of the current status of Indus civilization, especially some interesting aspects of Indus civilization based on our own research as well as others' research. Okay, so what we can actually see is that Gujarat often is considered rightly as the southern frontier of the Indus civilization. We know that there are several sites which are actually kind of located in Gujarat. the first site was the first site of the Indus civilization to be discovered from Gujarat was Rangpur. That was in 1993, which was immediately followed after some 10, 15 years by the discoveries of Lothal and a number of sites which are distributed in almost all parts of Gujarat, like Kachchh, Saurashtra, and parts of central Gujarat, thereby kind of establishing the presence of Indus civilization quite firmly in Gujarat. The most important excavation that actually kind of played a significant role here was the excavations carried out by S.R. Rao in the 1960s at Lothal. I mean, prior to that, he did excavate Rangpur. And it is the Lothal excavation actually brought to the attention of the world into Gujarat as far as the Indus civilization is concerned. And this has actually been confirmed by the subsequent studies carried out by many institutions. And also in the late 1980s and 1990s, excavations at Dholavira, which actually brought out a very marvelously preserved large Harappan center, urban center at Dholavira, excavated by Dr. R.S. Bist. So what you actually see is the terminologies which we may actually use to describe the development stages of the Indus civilization, the Harappan civilization. I would actually prefer to use this term pre-urban, urban, and the post-urban. You can actually kind of interchange that with early Harappan, the mature Harappan, and the late Harappan, even though there are certain contentious issues regarding that, but then we won't actually get into that. So if you actually now look at the distribution or the number of sites belong to Indus civilization today, there are more than, a recent study actually suggests more than 750 Harappan sites. The number of sites would actually go up, as and when we actually kind of explore more and more intensively in certain regions. Certain small sites will actually come up. But in any case, what one can see, the large number of sites have been actually found in Gujarat, and they are actually distributed as the cluster actually shows in almost all parts of Gujarat, Kachchh, Saurashtra, North Gujarat, and even southern part of Gujarat. Many of these sites, in fact, are actually very small sites, and then you actually have the larger settlements in Gujarat, in fact, are very few. I suppose the largest one which you see is Dholavira, which is actually kind of the walled area is around 48 hectares. But if you actually consider the outlying area, it might be actually as big as 65 hectares or so. That's the picture which actually shows the features of the large urban center at Dholavira. We have most of the other settlements of Indus civilization, in fact, are tinier, much more smaller. For example, the Lothal, the other very well-known Harappan sites in Gujarat, that is just 10 hectares. You can actually see that just 1/4 or 1/5 of Dholavira. So many other centers, in fact, are much smaller. And in fact, in Saurashtra, most of the sites are actually rural settlements, which actually, the size actually varies from just 1 hectare to maybe 15 hectares at the most. Some of the larger settlements are 10 to 15 hectares. So that, in fact, is the nature of Harappan settlements. If you actually look at the size distribution of sites belonging to the Indus civilization. And what I'm talking about is primarily about the urban phase, as well as also the post-urban or the late Harappan phase. Okay. Now, there's another interesting aspect about the Indus civilization in Gujarat. In fact, is if you examine the material remains which are actually found from sites in Kachchh and Saurashtra, the Kachchh sites are actually found to be, as far as the material remains are concerned, they are found to be much more closely affiliated to the material remains you come across in the Indus Valley sites like Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, or in the sites in Gagar Saraswati system. This probably may be because they are geographically more closer to the Indus region. So you do actually come across those, the Harappan the kind of Harappan remains you come across in this region, much more well pronounced in the Harappans, like sites in Kachchh, like Dholavira or Kanmir, Shikarpur, or Surkotada, or Kirsara. These are the sites which are recently excavated. All of them actually show this feature. But when you come down to Saurashtra, excluding sites like Lothal, or the one which you see it in here, Bagasra or Nageshwar, excluding these three sites, all other sites which are actually shown in these red marks, they do not actually show the same material cultural remains. Cultural remains you come across, in fact, are distinctly different from the Harappan, many respects. They do show, in terms of technological aspect, they do actually show close resemblance. But the actual attributes, if you take at the material remains, they do actually show a marked difference. This has actually been noticed right from the very beginning, starting from M.S. Vagh's time. M.S. Vagh was the first person to excavate Rangpur in 1933. He actually found most probably it is essentially belonged to Indus civilization, the material which he excavated from Rangpur, but he thought that could actually be an evolved form of the Indus civilization. Therefore, he actually called it probably belonged to the later phase, and that got stuck, in the sense that most of the material remains you actually come across in Saurashtrian site, which actually resembled what has been reported from Rangpur. Then it was actually thought that almost all of these settlements in Saurashtra actually sprang up in the later part of the Harappa culture. That is the way the developmental features of Indus civilization in Gujarat was actually kind of perceived for a long time, till almost 1980s. So what all these red spots you actually see, these are all the sites in Saurashtra showing that different material culture, different from what you actually come across many of the sites in Kachchh. It doesn't mean that there are no sites which are actually showing Saurashtrian characters, Saurashtrian-like characters in Kachchh. There are many. There are more than 100 sites in Kachchh. So many of them are actually showing that that feature. This red dot you actually see is Kota Badali, which is a site excavated by Gujarat State Archaeology Department in collaboration with the Deccan College, which actually is a Surat Harappan site. So there are sites of that nature which are found in Kachchh, but then by and large, there is a preponderance of this, what we call the classical Harappan, or the material remains which actually close the Indus-like features more in here. Now, the idea about the Harappan habitation in Saurashtra and also in North Gujarat, for that matter, central Gujarat, actually sprang up in the later part of the Harappa culture was to change. This actually happened in the 1980s. What in fact actually had happened was that one of the events that actually led to this change, in fact, was excavations at Rojdi. Rojdi here, my cursor shows at the central part of Saurashtra in Rajkot district. This was excavated in the 1980s by a jointly excavated by a team by Professor Greg Postel of Pennsylvania University, Philadelphia, and Gujarat State Archaeology Department. Material culture remains which are actually found from the site actually suggested, according to the earlier model that was actually followed, it could actually be a late Harappan site. So they were actually expecting to come across a date that could actually indicate probably somewhere later than 1900 BC or 2000 BC, anything earlier than that. All right. But then, and also one should actually remember that the radiocarbon dates were actually being extensively used from later part of the 60s onwards in order to kind of date the excavated sites. And it is in that light one should actually see the number of these radiocarbon dates which actually the excavation team can actually kind of extract from Rojdi, reveal the date going back almost contemporary with the urban phase of Indus civilization. As you can see, the date over there, it actually forms an average date of almost 2600 BC for the early levels, suggesting that even though there is no the material remains you come across this site of Rojdi and other affiliated sites look different from the classical Harappan. They were actually contemporary. That is when fossil unravel actually kind of proposed this model of what we call the regional diversity. So prior to this, most people actually thought that in the research model which one actually followed, in fact, was that the Indus civilization is actually kind of homogeneous. It actually shows similar kind of artifact or material remains throughout its, the length and breadth of its cultural spread. This actually was to change. And the Rogeri excavation is probably the first site of first excavation, which actually kind of very clearly demonstrated these through dates as well as the material remains. Okay, so what one can see is that the dates coming from Rogeri, in fact, is 2600 BC to 1900 BC. Now, many of those sites in Saurashtra now, which actually shows the similar kind of material remains as Rogeri, is now found to be contemporary with the Harappans. They were no more the late Harappans. Now, so what is this regional diversity? How is this regional diversity studied and understood? These are some of the interesting aspects about the regional aspect of the Harappa culture in Gujarat. What you can actually see is that this is the plan and the architectural structures excavated at Rogeri, as you can actually see. It does actually have a kind of fortification. The Rogeri site is almost 7 hectares, quite large site, and it actually got a perimeter wall or a kind of fortification wall, as you can actually see. But the difference in here is that in the case of classical Harappan, the fortifications, in fact, are quite massive. At Dolavera, I suppose the base of the fortification is almost 18 meters deep, 18 meters broad, and at the top it is almost 10 meters. Extent height. Whereas Bagasra, which is actually a very small settlement of just 2 hectares, less than 2 hectares, it has got a fortification or a perimeter wall, which is around 7.75 meters at the base. So you can actually imagine that, the Harappans appears to have, the classical Harappans appears to have a fixation for actually building a quite massive fortification around the settlement. That appears not to be the norm for the Harappans in Saurashtra, where the fortifications appear to be, there were fortifications. There was this concept of actually kind of protecting those settlements by a perimeter wall. But then the walls, in fact, were actually much smaller, around 3 meters or less than 3 meters, 2.5 to 3 meters. That is generally the thickness of the fortification wall. And in addition to that, most of the houses were actually built of stone. That may be because the stone was easily available in Saurashtra. But then you do not actually come across the use of mud bricks, whereas the Harappans are actually well known for their standard mud bricks, showing a kind of standard length, thickness, breadth ratio. So none of the Saurashtrian Harappan sites, what is actually now known as Surat Harappan, named after fossil unravel, actually named these, the Harappan manifestation of the Harappa culture in Saurashtra region as the Surat Harappan, Surat being one of the traditional name of Saurashtra. So what you actually come across, there are more than 500 sites belonging to this particular regional variety found in Saurashtra. And none of them actually really show use of mud bricks or baked bricks. They were all actually built of stone architecture or a stone, or sometimes just, when it is very rural, it is just battleland of kind of structures. This could be partially because of the economy, partially because of the tradition which they actually kind of followed. These are the differences one can actually easily make out when you compare the material remains you actually between the classical Harappan and the Surat Harappans. And another interesting feature you actually come across right from the very beginning at Rogeri, you actually come across use of polygonal as well as curvilineal structure. This is actually from Rogeri, and you can also see another curvilinear structure on the on the right. And this one is actually from Kuntasi. That's another Surat Harappan site, which is actually located very close to the Gulf of Kachch. And also the circular structures actually became very popular in the late Harappan times. And you can actually see several of such circular structures are actually found at Dholavere in the last phase, when the urban phase actually completely declined. But this appears to be a legacy of and associated with those circular structures, you actually come across the Surat Harappan cultural materials. So what one can see is, whereas in the case of classical Harappan, you do not have these either polygonal structures or the circular structure. They were actually quite more perfectionist, kind of making either rectangular or a squarish kind of structures, using bricks. Sorry. Yeah, this is actually the fortification in one of such Surat Harappan site, which we had actually excavated, a Pithat, quite large site, around 15 hectares in size. You can actually see the wall is around 2.75 to 2.8 meters thick, built up massive blocks of stone, okay, which essentially means that a lot of energy, a lot of resources have actually been spent on building on these structures. Which in fact is an interesting factor. So what one can therefore actually see is that there is basic difference in the size of the settlement. If you compare with the classical Harappan and the Surat Harappan, the classical Harappan sites are found to be relatively larger. On an average, the site is around 10.8. The largest one, of course, is Dholavere, which is very large. Rest of the sites are actually small, and then it actually comes to 10 to 15 on an average, 10.8 hectares. Whereas when you come to Surat Harappan, the largest one is actually just 15 hectares, which is Pithat. Lothal is actually just 10.1, so it's actually bigger than Lothal. But many of the sites, in fact, are, as I said, is just 1 hectare or 2 hectare, maximum 3 or 4 hectares. So what you can actually see is that 4.5 is the average size. So you can see this size difference as well between the classical Harappan sites as well as the Surat Harappan. In addition to that, there is some kind of resemblance in the planning of the settlements. You can see that the Harappan town planning is well known. I'm not actually going to describe about it. You can see a semblance of that planning in the case of Surat Harappan sites as well. At Pithat, large settlements like Rojdi or Pithat, they actually show this planning. This rectangular in plan, and it has got structures within, and it has also got an open court which is also protected by a wall. Primarily, kind of one does not know, following the with classical Harappan tradition, but not exactly the same way. This is actually a line drawing of the fortification with the massive fortification associated structures which we have at Pithat. I have actually kind of brought in here in order to show you that not all Surat Harappan sites, in fact, were actually a rural settlement. They were actually some of them were actually economically reasonably well off, because they could actually invest a lot of resources to build these kind of structures. So suggesting that some of these, some of the settlements were actually tending towards the kind of quasi urban status, where they were able to kind of produce some amount of wealth, which can actually kind of invest it back into the improvement of the settlement, especially building those structures and massive fortification walls, etc. Yeah, you can here as well. You can see these circular structures and also the polygonal structures. Now, they also show, what about the other aspects of, economic activities? You do actually come across many of these beads, which you actually see in here, most probably may have been got into the site because of the exchange and interaction with the classical Harappan sites, which are in the vicinity. Not all of them, as you can actually see on the right, these are very clumsily and crudely made beads. And which does not actually show the fineness of the Harappan bead technology, the very well-known Harappan bead technology. And also you do actually come across bead rough outs in some of the sites. This is from Pithat. As you can see, this one, It's a small little disc bead which is they were trying to perforate it, and that means the beads were actually probably made locally at the site. And this is another one which is just referred, not perforated. So there appears to be some attempt to make probably imitating the classical Harappans. The craftsmen probably did not have the same kind of expertise in making those beads, and probably they were linked with the Harappan economic production in a different way. But some of the sites were actually trying their hand in bead production as well, in different material, especially in the semi-precious stone beads. And also you can see some of these. This is a failed attempt, Fane's bead production. It's completely turned into black and then very badly produced. And there are also other material like shell, which has actually been used for making beads, and they become quite abundant in many of the large Surat Harappan settlements, primarily indicating that there were some amount of craft activity at smaller scale, which were actually going on in these Surat Harappan sites, the regional Harappan sites as well. But the basic distinction one actually come across in the Saurashtra or Surat Harappan sites and the classical Harappan sites is the food that they actually consumed. In the sense that the classical Harappans or the Indus Valley, they essentially depended upon winter crops like wheat, barley, and the other food grains that goes with along with that wheat and barley, the pulses, the lentil, etc. These are actually, of course, they are actually found from the Saurashtrians, and they're very, very rare. The most important food grain that has been actually recovered from the Surat Harappan sites, in fact, are the millet, the smaller millet, the larger millets as well. But the larger millets actually enter in the scene much later in time. In the early times, around 2600 BC or so, it was primarily the smaller millets like the foxtail. There are 6 different types of smaller millets, which has been actually kind of reported from several Surat Harappan sites in Saurashtra, suggesting their dependence on millets. Millets are, in fact, quite suitable for the semi-arid environment in Gujarat and partly of Kachchh. So that is essentially the reason that you do actually come across the prominence in the Surat Harappan sites. So this essentially means that the cuisine of the Harappans, the Surat Harappans in Saurashtra, certainly varied from the cuisines of the Harappans in the Indus Valley. And this difference in the cuisines actually is, you can actually see it. We made a small table which actually shows the presence of these winter crops and the millets in different classical Harappan sites and Surat Harappan sites. You can actually see that mostly small millets and just barley, no evidence of wheat. And sometimes even at Lothal, you have no wheat, but not even rice, not even barley, but you have evidence of rice, which is actually debated. But in any case, what important is that it is the millets which actually dominate in the floral records of the Surat Harappan sites, especially in the Harappan sites in Gujarat. It appears that even when you actually deal with the urban sites like Lothal or at Surkot, we do not know anything about the floral records of Dholavira. So you have wheat with question mark from Surkota. But the most dominant one, in fact, is small millet, suggesting that wheat probably would have been an exotic item, which must have been actually consumed at special occasions. So it must have been certainly not extensively cultivated in this region, and that actually makes the Surat Harappans or the Harappan sites in Saurashtra quite distinct from the Harappan. It is basically the food what you eat actually many a times kind of defines what you are, I suppose, and that is what you can actually see in the case of and the cuisine variation is actually reflected even in the vessels you actually come across. One of the important things which you can easily identify or which you can actually kind of identify the Surat Harappan sites from the classical Harappan sites is the potteries. The potteries being actually plastic in quality, they actually reflect the changes or much more graphically than other artifacts. So what you can actually see is that the Surat Harappan sites are actually dominated by by dishes, which are serving vessels, also cooking vessels like forks, etc. But those vessels are actually found to be different in the sense they do actually technologically show a close similarity with the Harappans, but their attributes like the features, the painting style, etc., are actually found to be quite different from the classical Harappan. Many of the type fossils of the classical Harappans are actually found to be completely absent in the classical, in the Surat Harappan site. That, in fact, is the distinction, and this distinction is essentially linked with the cuisines they actually the difference in the cuisines they actually consumed. The most ubiquitous vessel form you can actually come across in Surat Harappan sites are these bowls. And these bowls are actually these hemispherical bowls, of different articulation of their body shape. These sort of bowls, in fact, are almost completely absent in the classical Indus sites in the Indus Valley proper. They do have bowls, very rare, but then their morphology are entirely different from this. And Surat Harappan sites are actually kind of dominated by these forms, probably suggesting that this kind of reflect the kind of cuisines they actually took, in the sense that most probably the fluid kind of cuisines, like the porridge or the semi-liquid kind of a cuisine, that probably dominated the Surat Harappan group of sites. And probably millets, it is much easier to kind of smaller millets is actually kind of much easier to make for the semi-liquid or porridge kind of food. That is just an assumption. There is no factual evidence for that. Now, this is extremely important because Harappan cuisines and differences can actually be studied by residue analysis. And for the residue analysis, you have the cooking vessels. On the right side, what you see is the classical Harappan cooking vessels. Okay. Which essentially suggests that the classical Harappans did a peculiar way of actually kind of making their food items. Their cuisine certainly did vary from what you actually come across in Surat Harappans. These are the serving vessels, the bowls and the dishes. So if you are actually able to extract the residues, and the residues like fatty acids or starch, and also these days you can also do the proteomics analysis. Of late, people are actually trying to do that. One can actually kind of make out the difference in the kind of food items they actually consumed. Of late, I suppose, there is a research paper which has very recently came out, which actually talked about many of these bowls the Harappan bowls have been actually used for handling or consuming dairy products. They could actually kind of collect dairy fatty acid which are related to dairy from those. I suppose those kind of studies would actually help us to understand this regional variation between the classical Harappans and the Surat Harappans in a much more scientific way. And probably the fatty acid and studies and using gas chromatometry, which probably had not been very properly employed so far, that would actually yield a better result, along with the proteomics, a huge area with high potential for understanding the and distinguishing different cuisines of different regions. I suppose IIT Gandhinagar, in fact, does have a program to study these residues of Harappan pottery or Harappan diet. Now, we will actually now try to understand the root of the Surat Harappan diversity. How and what, in fact, where exactly the diversity actually come from, and for understanding the roots of this diversity, we may actually go back to the Chalcolithic culture that actually were agro-pastoral communities, which actually flourished in Gujarat prior to the beginning of the urban phase of Indus civilization. It has been always actually argued that the agricultural way of life in Gujarat actually started with the urban phase of inter-civilization. It is thought that during the urban phase, the Harappans actually expanded from the Indus Valley into Gujarat. That has actually been found to be not really correct. And recent studies of the 1980s onwards actually have quite clearly indicated through various sets of evidence, which includes comfortable dates, that there were at least a few Chalcolithic, food agro-pastoral settlement using copper and lithic implements and practicing what is known as opportunistic and marginal agriculture that actually flourished in different parts of Gujarat, especially in northern part of Gujarat and Saurashtra coast. And what's also interesting, in fact, is that they have been actually dated almost 3600 BC. The evidence which we have from North Gujarat that goes back to 3600 BC is actually named as the Anartha tradition, that primarily because Anartha being the traditional name of North Gujarat. And then you have equally old, 3,600-year-old, evidence going back to that age from Padri, a site which is actually located on the Saurashtra, in the Bhavanagar district on the Saurashtra coast. There's also another, very interesting, early Chalcolithic remains which we come across in this region. That is, pre-Prabhas, but is generally described as pre-Prabhas. The remains of which are actually found in two sites, located geographically quite far apart. One is in North Gujarat, and the other is in Saurashtra coast in Jamnagar district. The Anartha and Padri, I will actually show you, they are found to be very similar in their material remains. So what does it actually suggest? It essentially suggests that as early as 3000 or 3600 BC, different regions of Gujarat, in fact, has been actually kind of interacting quite intensively, which actually resulted into what is known as sharing of traits, cultural traits among them. I will actually show. I will actually look at the one of these early Chalcolithic cultures, that is the Anartha in North Gujarat, closely. The evidence for this actually comes from the site Loteshwar, which is actually located here. There are a few sites showing similar kind of cultural remains, which are found primarily kind of distributed in northern part of Gujarat. The area which I act, northern part of Gujarat and eastern part of Kachchh, where my cursor actually moves. Okay, the type site for this, in fact, is Loteshwar, which was actually excavated by the MS University. The site is actually located on a stabilized sand dune, quite high sand dune, by the bank of a small little river known as the Khari. And what's interesting here is that this is a site which actually kind of shows a very thin habitational deposit actually, but actually dominated by a lot of these pits, as you actually see it in here. Okay, and this is actually dated by several radiocarbon dates, which appears to be quite consistent. Then by conventional radiocarbon date going back to 3698 BC, as well as from AMS dates going back to 3657 BC. So what one can see is that the site at Loteshwar appears to have been occupied starting from 3700 BC onwards. It does have a Mesolithic substratum, which has been dated, once again dated more than 3-4 dates, all of them actually earlier than or around 7000 BC, suggesting that the site was actually a preferred location for hunters and gatherers, as well as the subsequent what we call the agro-pastoralists, sometimes actually showing kind of transition from hunting and gathering to food production. Anyway, what is interesting here is that from these habitational deposits, these pits, one believed that this probably must have been used for the storage purpose. And the white patch you see in here, there's also another bit here which also show the same feature. This has been found to be concentrated form of phytoliths, grass phytolith. It appears that people must have been actually kind of making a cushion of insect, some of those plant leaves which has got insecticide qualities, and then storing the harvested food grain probably for some period of time over there. That is how this part at the bottom actually had a highly concentrated phytolith formation. Now, what has been found from the Chalcolithic level, in fact, is all these interesting, very few food grains have been actually found. But most of them actually primarily belong to the millets, which includes small millets, horse gram, as well as sesame. Sesame. This is domesticated sesame. These are all going back to a date of 3,700 to 3,600 BC. These were the food grains: no wheat, no barley, suggesting that they were essentially depending upon local products. So compare that with what we have actually come across in Surat Harappan sites. So primarily, it's the same food grains which has been actually followed. And then what are the kind of ceramics we actually come across in association with this early Chalcolithic remains at Loteshwar? You can see they are dominated by bowls and also medium size. There are many other pots: bowls, basins, and medium sized pot. All of them actually showing features of their own, quite individualistic of that region. And what is important is that all these vessels are all handmade, or at the most slow moving turntable made. And then you do actually come across use of this white pigment, etc., which are often regarded as a trait of the early Harappans, because the urban Harappans seldom actually used white as a pigment for extensively for decorating their pottery. So what is important here is the predominance of the bowls, suggesting that as early as 3,600 BC or 700 BC, they were essentially kind of using bowls, which is quite similar to what we actually, these are the bowls from Loteshwar, and the basins, quite similar to the bowls and basins which we actually come across in the Surat Harappan sites. This would probably suggest the continuity of the same kind of food grains, which we have actually seen in the archaeological record. Also same kind of cuisines, in the sense that porridge kind of semi-fluid kind of food items. So this actually therefore is an interesting area to investigate, to find out this continuity and also the diversity with the urban Harappans or the classical Harappan through different methods of residue analysis. And the ceramic assemblages and material remains which we come across at Loteshwar in North Gujarat is found to be quite similar to what has been actually reported from Padri, which is actually located on the Saurashtra coast of the Bhavanagar coast of Saurashtra. Okay. So these are some of the pictures which actually show the similarity, which you can actually see the bowls, it's the same kind of bowl, same kind of decoration, suggesting that there is a quite, and also these pots, which actually shows the use of white pigment quite extensively. This is the Padri, and on the other side, you can actually see the another similar kind of design, suggesting they probably belong to the same kind of cultural, or they share a lot of traits in common, including in the kind of food items. Unfortunately, there are no botanical remains collected or published from Padri excavation. So we do not know what kinds of food items did they actually consume. All these sites do actually have domesticated cattle, sheep, and goat, which actually do not actually vary between the classical Harappans and the Surat. Both of them actually kept the same kind of animals, the cattle, sheep, and goat. And these are the domesticated animals you come across Surat Harappans, as well as in the classical Harappans. And in addition to that, you also do come across in the another tradition. You do actually the kind of structure they actually built, in fact, were wattle and daub, which you can actually see on the basis of these clay lumps with the reed impression. But also you come across other materials like terracotta beads, terracotta kind of, I don't know whether it's spindle wall or little discs, and also some stone beads, and also of shell beads, very primitive in style. These are also Amazonite as well as carnelian. Also are found from Loteshwar along with this Anarda. But what is also interesting is that these figurines, the human figurines from Loteshwar and Nagwada, both actually belonging to the Anarda tradition. What you can actually see is that these figurines are distinctly different from the classical Harappans. They actually therefore show a regional feature, and which is very peculiar to Anarda, quite minimalistic in style. You can actually see just a piece of clay, and then it's actually, the features are actually kind of indicated by just pinching them, very minimalistic. And you can actually show that the pin bricks on it in order to indicate some kind of decorations or attributes. In this particular case, there's a female figurine, as you can actually see, one of the breasts actually kind of fallen off from the area, the other is still intact. And the features, the navel, as well as the decorated hand, the mouth, eyes and ears are actually kind of indicated by pressing a steatite bead onto it. Okay, so that's again quite an interesting feature, but quite regional, not conforming to the classical Harappan. And surprisingly enough, what you can actually see is that similar kind of terracotta human figurines are actually reported from the northern part of Vanu Basin, that is in the northern part of Pakistan. A site known as Sherry Khan Tarakai, a site which has been actually explored by the British team along with the Pakistan archaeologists. You can actually see the similarities in here, suggesting that there appears to be some kind of shared traits in spite of the vast geographical distance that actually the Loteshwar and the northern Pakistan side actually has. One does not really know how this similarity actually came into existence, but then you can actually see this difference. Probably just a strange coincidence as well. But what also you need to remember, none of the Surat Harappan sites in Saurashtra, Rojdi or other sites actually show human figurines. No human figurines, in fact, are actually found any one of the Surat Harappan sites. This is also quite an interesting feature to kind of note. Now, the concrete evidence of interaction of the Gujarat region with the Indus region is actually indicated by the evidence which we have from a nearby site. This is Loteshwar. A nearby site is Datrana. This site was also excavated by the team from the MS University of Baroda. And we, in fact, were actually able to come across the early Harappan material remains from this site. Early Harappan material remains from the site, and in association with materials which are actually similar to what has been reported from pre-Prabhas here. And that has been actually dated to pre-Prabhas at Somnath has been dated to 3000 BC, whereas this has been dated to 3300 BC. So I will actually just quickly take you those features. This is the site once again located on a large sand dune, and this has also got a Mesolithic substratum, which is followed by the very thin deposit of this early Harappan and the pre-Prabhas material, which you actually can see. This is the Chalcolithic layer containing all these materials, and which has been dated. AMS dated to around 3300 BC, and the pottery you come across. This is the pre-Prabhas pottery, which has been very similar to what has been reported from Somnath. These are the this has no resemblance with what you actually seen at Anartha. Anartha is much earlier, and this is certainly later. And in association with that pottery was found the early Harappan pottery, which actually shows quite close similarity with the early Harappan pottery report from Balakot, Kodigi, and other sites in the Indus Valley. The difference here is that this pottery is actually all handmade or turntable made. The fast wheel was not actually known to them. Whereas when you come to here, the early Harappan pottery, which is found in association with the pre-Prabhas, is actually found to be all fast wheel made of very fine clay, which is which is one of the hallmarks of the early Harappans. And the vessel forms are actually found to be very similar to what has been reported from Fort Tiki and Balakot, clearly indicating that this must have certainly come from in the Indus region, suggesting the close interaction of the Indus region with the northern part of Gujarat, especially Kachchh and North Gujarat. And that has been actually confirmed by the presence of these Rohari chert blades. Rohari chert blade, as we know, is actually found only, it is actually found at Rohari Hills, and then you can see they are actually found at Datrana going back to 3300 BC, along with the local Chalcolithic blades. And what you also see is the use, and also some bead production, evidence of bead production is also found from the same site. So these are actually material belong to the early Harappans, showing very close Indus affiliation, suggesting the extent of Indus, trades into Kachchh and Gujarat. And Datrana, in addition to all these things, is a huge blade manufacturing site, utilizing the local chalcedony and agate. You can see the extensive use of trusted guiding technique for the production of these blades. And this, in fact, this has been dated to 3300 BC. This, in fact, the earliest date for trusted guiding technique in Gujarat, probably in Western India. The other site has been actually dated earlier than this, having trusted guiding technique. So it appears that it was the incoming early Harappans from the Indus region, where they have already been practicing this technology, actually brought in this technology along with the fast wheel around 3000 BC. This in fact has influenced this technology, transmission, extension of technology, both in lithic blade production as well as the pottery production. In fact, has influenced them immensely in the growth of Indus civilization in Gujarat. Many of the local, the indigenous traditions, or the regional, like the Anartha or Pre-Prabhas or the Padri, they kind of adopted this technology and started producing the blades. And this is exactly what we see, in the Surat Harappan. Surat Harappan essentially is the adoption of this fast wheel for making those bowls which were originally handmade or made on a turntable. Once they actually know the wheel production, the bowls actually become much more even, symmetrical, and that actually becomes the hallmark of the Surat Harappans. So what we therefore actually see is that quite an immense contribution, especially in the area of technology, various levels of technology, both be it in pottery production, fast wheel, or in lithic technology, or probably enhanced, the much more efficient way of agriculture, etc., must have been actually introduced by the interaction with the early Harappans from the Indus region, primarily because they are actually quite proficient. The people, those who are in here, are quite proficient in this technology, and their interaction with this region actually helped the region in Gujarat to kind of integrate themselves into the larger developmental process of the Harappa culture in Gujarat. All right. Now, we have actually seen that the Harappan expansion, or the expansion of the Harappa culture, actually probably started in the early Harappan times, not in the urban times. But then the question is that what actually prompted the Harappans? What actually prompted the Harappans to kind of move from the Indus Valley toward the south? What prompted the southward extension? Most probably in search of the initial stage, in search of greener pastures, looking for what is known as a pastoral land, and also subsequently, as the urban growth actually picked up pace in this region, the new raw materials, and most of the raw materials upon which the Harappan craft production actually depend upon, be it shell or the semi-precious stone beads, were all primarily coming from the Gujarat region, either in the Saurashtra coast or from different parts of Saurashtra. This is what most probably, that is the reason why, the Gujarat actually played an extremely important role in the urban growth of the Indus civilization. This is a map which has been prepared by Randallo. I have just mildly modified it. So you can actually see these are the regions where we actually have raw material sources for many of those semi-precious stone beads which are easily available. And these were actually exploited right from the early Harappan times. As early as 3300 BC, we have the evidence actually coming from Dathrana, where they were actually trying their hand in bead production as early as 3300 BC. So you actually have this, the shell craft production, shell which are actually found along the Saurashtra coast. So the result, in fact, was that the emergence of these large urban centers like Dholavira and Lothal. All right. But in addition to this, we know that the contributions of these two sites in great measures. But in addition to that, there were also other centers, smaller centers like Nageshwar, Bagasra, or Nagwada, which is actually a small, very small village, which also actually contributed in the urban growth. The urban growth in the sense that they were all integrated in the economic production of the urban Harappan. That is actually important. Both larger settlements, there appears to be a hierarchy of settlements which actually contributing toward the overall economic production, especially the craft production and agricultural production of the Harappans. I will actually show some of the interesting evidence about this craft production from Bagasra, from our own excavation. A small little site which is located very close to the Gulf of Kachchh, measuring just 2 hectares. The fortified area is just 0.3 hectares, measuring 55 meter by 63 meters. Very, very small. Okay. But then you actually can see different evidence for the craft production from within the fortified area as well as the outside the fortified area. It is within the fortified area you actually come across the maximum amount of craft production. And this is one of those evidence where with the shell workshop, which actually shows different stages of bangle production. As you can see, there are more than 3,000 such bangles which have been actually produced. So this actually tells the story of what is known as urban Harappan economic production, which actually helped them to maintain the urban status for almost 600 to 700 years, from 2600 BC to 1900 BC. It's possible because these raw materials were easily available. And equally important was, you can actually see evidence of the bangle, bead production coming from Bagasra. These are little silos which actually shows the silos which actually show stockpiling of raw materials. And by the side of it, you also see the area where the fans production was actually carried out. This appears to be a kind of workman's quarters where the bead production and also other kinds of the fans bead production was probably actually carried out. Small site, but actually showing interesting evidence of craft production at the site. That in fact is the silo excavated at Bagasra. You can see this interesting raw material, very rare raw material, which is actually found in Jamnagar region. And that has been actually kind of stockpiled in different silos, and probably that is the way they kind of control the production, so that they can actually kind of retain the quality as well as the premium, which is actually attached to such rare beads, which was essential for what is known as which is essentially essential for maintaining the economic growth. So many sites actually show this evidence. This is actually evidence from Shikarpur, where you actually see all these kind of evidence, but then you have the bead rough outs, finished beads, etc. And one of the important items which actually you come across in all these sites, in fact, wherever you have bead production, is the presence of these drill bits, earnestite drill bits, which in fact in most of the sites, we do have the classical Harappan sites do have it. This is a material which was actually used for, especially for making, drilling holes in hard stones, be it small beads or the long carnelian beads, which are sometimes 2 inches in long. They were all probably primarily drilled by using these drill bits. Now, when exactly the Harappans actually kind of started using this drill, we actually do not know. It's certainly during the urban Harappan times. They were not actually known during the early Harappan times, because what we actually come across in the early Harappan times, these drill bits were actually not reported from any one of the early Harappan times. It has been actually, this is a kind of a very interesting material, whether it is a geological material which has not been so far identified, or which is actually a kind of a stone, a clay stone, which has been actually kind of transformed by the Harappans by pyrotechnology, is kind of debated by the experts, which is essentially very interesting to actually read this. The discussion on what actually is this material. It's actually named as ernestite after Ernest Mackay, who actually reported this first from Chanudaro. The quality, this is important because this has got a special quality by which you can actually kind of drill holes much easier than other material, other stone. And till the Harappans actually realized the potentials of this material, it is really difficult for the Harappans to actually kind of efficiently make this make holes in these hard stones. Once they actually kind of recognize or realize this technology, this material in its potential, that is when the Harappan bead as a craft item actually started flourishing. It has been also argued that the source of this raw material, most probably by Randall Lowe, who actually kind of extensively investigated it, after the initial studies by Professor Mark Knoyer and Massimo Vidale. He is of the opinion most probably the source could actually be somewhere in North Gujarat or parts of Kachchh. It has not actually been proved. This is primarily based on the large number of these ernestite drill bits, which are actually found in Harappan sites in Kachchh and adjoining regions, and also large chunks of this material, which has been found from several sites in Kachchh and North Gujarat. I'm told that a large chunk of this material was actually found from South Gujarat, from Bhagat Rao. That in fact is one of the important aspects, in the sense that it is this drill bits most probably actually helped Harappans to kind of make this bead craft as a viable economic activity, it appears. So this is actually the evidence from Datrana, where you actually have early Harappan beads, which were actually kind of pierced, as you can see, very clumsy attempt to pierce these beads by using same kind of material, chalcedony. But as you know, both of them do have the same hardness. It is not very easy to make hole when they have the same hardness. So some abrasives probably must have been actually used in order to make holes by using same material. It has actually been suggested, but then even then, it actually very, very time-consuming, very laborious task. It is only the ernestite which actually kind of helped the Harappans to actually kind of make bead drilling much more easier, and they can actually produce them in large numbers, which actually kind of was a big step in the economic progress or the urban growth of the industrialization. And then even at Harappa, you have similar kind of drill, but they are all made of local material. Ernestite was certainly not found. We do have the use of this material even in the smallest village, probably suggesting that the tannite was not an exotic material for the Kachch or North Gujarat sites, whereas in the Indus Valley proper, it appears to be not so popular. So that is probably the reason Randall Lowe kind of suggested that the source material for the raw material could actually be somewhere in North Gujarat or Kachch. All right, I suppose the last part which I am wanting to highlight within 2 minutes, in fact, is this very interesting and peculiar pottery that has been actually found from the most of the Hindu sites in Kachch, or the classical Harappan sites in Kachch. Okay, this what is known as the research slipware. This has been actually many times seen as one of the typoses of the classical Harappans of Kachch region or in Gujarat. And only 3 sets of these are actually reported from Mohenjo-daro, making that it was not actually pottery which is quite popular in the Indus Valley and Gagar Saraswati system. And in most of the sites in Kachch actually have hundreds of them, and they are actually found in many different vessel forms, most of the times dishes, sometimes dish on stand, and also small pots, etc. This is a normal kind of pottery which we actually come across. It has got a gray core, and then it has got a double slip, the first slip and the second slip. First slip is darker, second is lighter, and it's actually kind of removed in a reserved manner, hence the reserved slipware. So you come across many different variants in that, the color may vary. But what is interesting is that, this is very peculiar to Kachch. It appears that it is, and probably not very popular among Harappans. Why do I say that? None of the classical Harappan forms are actually found to have the research technique, research slip decoration. The research slipwares are actually found to be, the vessel forms are actually found to be following the local vessel forms, which essentially suggests you can actually see these kind of pots which are certainly not the Harappan, the bowls, different kinds of bowls which are certainly not Harappan. Even when you have dish on stand, the features are actually different from the classical Harappan. They are more closer to what I would say the early Harappans, suggesting that this was a tradition probably coming from the early stages, the early part of the Harappa culture in Kachch, an early tradition of the Kachch Harappans rather than the classical Harappan. And you also do have many a times, what happens is that the second slip actually is a kind of semi-glaze or a kind of vitreous slip. I mean, it's actually the technical term used is sintered, because it actually kind of fused, not necessarily a true slip, but a kind of vitreous feature. This is the one which you actually come across in the classical Harappan context. But then, you do actually come across the early Harappan context without that vitreous slip, just 2 slips or sometimes just 1 slip, and then remove that slip in a restricted manner or reserved manner, imitating looking exactly the same way as my cursor moves here. Exactly the same way what you see it in this case. So in this case, most probably when, this is the tradition most probably that existed prior to the urban phase of Indus civilization. And the second slip which has been applied appears to be, it looks like some kind of a faint kind of a paste which has been actually applied. It from the pictures, it actually looks like there is no scientific study being done on it. It's actually an area where one can actually do a very good scientific study to understand whether it was a faint coating was actually done, similar kind of slip was actually applied, and then it was actually kind of removed in a restricted manner. And you do actually come across preserved slipware without that, sintered or vitrified a second slip coming from the early Harappan context from suggesting that it does have this reserved slip tradition. It does have a tradition that goes back earlier than the classical Harappan, and probably the higher technology of the classical Harappan was actually applied to create a much more pleasing design on these vessels, and that become very, very popular in the Kachch Harappans, which probably was not so much appreciated by the people, those who are in the Indus Valley. That is why you do not come across there being present. Those classical Harappan researchers were being present in large numbers in those sites. I suppose with that, I will actually stop my presentation. I Yeah, I thank you, all of you, for your patience. And then if there are any questions, I will be very happy to answer that.
Thank you so much, Professor Ajit. Such a wonderful talk on the various aspects of the Gujarat Harappan civilization, and also to understand the various regional manifestations. So the general thinking is that Harappan civilization means all the urban features, all the Harappan maybe ceramic forms and shapes in the Gujarat region. But here we are having much more to ponder upon, much more to explore upon, to understand maybe much more in a detailed manner. Maybe more sites, more investigations may also help in full understanding. But nevertheless, it's a kind of an eye opener, I would say, really to know about various regional manifestations, be it northern Gujarat or Saurashtra or southern Gujarat, and which might have contributed a lot for the urban phase of the Harappan civilization. Now I would request my colleague Sharda to moderate the question and answer session.
Okay, so I'll take up the ones in the Q&A box, and then I'll scroll through the chat. So the first question is by Rahul Thomas, who asks, so any site that is greater than 10 hectares is a large site, and anything less than that we classify as a small site. So what are the... Professor Ajithprasad, are you here? Yes.
Sorry, it get disconnected. Yeah.
So the first question...
Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah. So I'll repeat the question. Rahul Thomas asks that any site that is greater than 10 hectares is considered as a large site, and anything less than that should be classified as a small site. So are these the cutoff ranges, or?
That's an interesting question. But I think the large and small is, as you know, is quite subjective. It actually varies from region to region. If you go take the sites in the Indus Valley, the large is actually quite large. You know, even what do you call? Even Dholavira is just Dholavira is what 50 hectares, whereas the others Mohenjo-daro is much bigger, 80 hectares or even bigger than that. There is no fortification there, but then more than 80 hectares or even more than that. So is Harappa. So large and small is actually quite subjective. In the Gujarat case, I suppose when you say large, the largest in fact is just 48 hectares. And then all other sites are actually found to be less. And when we say 10 hectares is a small site, certainly not. 10 hectares in Gujarat context is a large site. But if you compare that with the sites in the Indus Valley, they are actually a small site in the urban context, the urban context. Yes.
Yeah. So the next one is from an anonymous person. He says, he or she is asking, is there any research and update on the script and language of the Harappan civilization? So
I think there was a talk which was organized by the Archaeology Center, IITGN, by Nisha Yadav. Nisha Yadav, I suppose a few months back. Yeah, I suppose she has actually updated all the recent research on in the script. Yes, there are people working on it to decipher the Indus script in many different ways. That's all I can actually say. I haven't actually worked in the Indus script, although I have been actually kind of trying to look at the graffiti which are actually found on the sites in Gujarat, which is actually a fascinating area. We just started working on it. Probably something interesting will come up. Okay.
So Michel has flagged the question. He says he would like to answer this.
No, yes, it was actually simply to refer the question to Nisha Yadav's talk, which should be online soon. We will, if it is not already, it will be soon online. All the talks eventually will be online. So that will be the best.
Yes. So the next question is, are there any seals that have been recovered from the Surat Harappan sites?
the question, in fact, was the seals.
Seals.
Yeah, but the thing was that there are no seals or such classical Harappan materials are actually found. Forget about seals. All that beads, etched carnelian beads or long carnelian beads, which are generally found in the classical Harappan. None of those the very characteristic classical Harappan materials are actually absent in the Surat Harappan site. That is probably the way one actually kind of easily understand and identify the Surat Harappan site, apart from the presence of bowls and etc. etc. Yeah.
The next one is any pre-Prabhas or Anartha culture artifacts that have been found in the Kachch region?
In the Kachch region, we have pre-Prabhas material which are actually found from Kachch. Yes, very close to Dholavira. There's a site which has actually been kind of explored by Dr. S.V. Rajesh of Kerala University. He did actually come across very similar material what has been reported from Datrana. He, in fact, was one of the team members of which excavated Datrana. He knows the material quite very well. So he has actually able to find some site in very close to Dholavira, which actually shows pre-Prabhas material. Yes, it is.
So what was the technique by which millets were cultivated, asks Professor Ajithprasad Pratap, in regular fields or on hill slopes?
What has actually been found in North Gujarat, in fact, the sites are actually located close to interdunal depression. So North Gujarat, in fact, is actually dominated by stabilized sand dunes. So these interdunal depressions retains water over a period of time, almost of the months of end of March. So what happens is that these depressions actually forms kind of a refugee areas where the wild grasses, including millets, would actually grow. These were probably exploited by the early hunter-gatherers and subsequently systematically kind of exploited by the agropastoralists. That's the model which we actually kind of proposed while understanding how exactly the food producing way of life kind of probably may have started off in North Gujarat as early as 3700 BC, quite independently, exploiting the local plant items, millets, as well as some pulses like microtyloma, that is host gram.
Okay.
Yes.
So the next question is by Abdul Hafiz Latifi, who asks what might be the exact fact behind these regional variations, where Gujarat community is different from the classical communities, and did they come into contact, or this was a result of climate variation? The whole talk was
yeah,
trying to answer this question.
Very interesting question, but the point is that these are areas very difficult to kind of pinpoint or say answer in black and white. Especially whether we're different communities. One would imagine that the Harappan, even in the urban phase, they were an heterogeneous community. It may not be in just one community. So that could have been there. And what comes off from the material remains is that people, those who lived in Saurashtra, essentially followed a different lifestyle, using different kinds of the materials which they use, the potteries they use were actually different from what has been actually used by the other communities. And this probably may have been triggered off because of the diversity in the food habits, in the sense that the cuisines, not the food habits, the cuisines, the way they actually produce the food items and then consume them. That probably did vary. So with that, different regions will have different belief systems, different way of actually doing things. That is part of the game, I suppose. That's all I suppose one can actually say at this point of time. One can actually take a certain very pointed aspect and research upon it and find out what actually is the truth. So that is probably the next stage of research that would actually continue. Yes.
Ashwin Vijayan asks, are there any developments in the understanding of the maritime activities and the urban growth of coastal Harappan centers?
There has actually been some studies regarding these maritime activities by looking at the there is a particular kind of vessel that is involved in the maritime activity, which are found in the Harappan context, known as black slipped jars. They are actually reported from several Harappan sites in Gujarat, and similar kind of vessels are actually found from the Omanese sites, contemporary Omanese sites in Oman Peninsula. The earlier studies have actually indicated that the source of the vessels are actually from the Indus Valley. That includes Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and they also suggested an unknown source for the clay when they did the clay matching studies. This was primarily done by Sophie Mary of CNRIs in France. And she suggested there could be an unknown source, and that could be Gujarat. We actually did send some samples for a study to her, but unfortunately she could not carry out that because she was not keeping very well, and then she could not take it up. Some of the samples are still lying with her. One can easily do that through thin section studies and other, X-ray study up and other studies to kind of do the clay matching, mineral matching, and then see the provenance of those, and that can be linked with the maritime activities. There are in many maritime, the classical Harappan sites which are located along the Saurashtra coast, except probably Lothal and Nageshwar. These are the two the classical Harappan sites you have in the Saurashtra coast. Rest of the sites are actually interior. You have Bagasra, which is actually, of course, much interior than the Arabian coast, and then you have Dholavira and all other sites. Yeah.
So there is another question related to the coastal region of Saurashtra.
Mm-hmm.
So Shikhar Rai asks, do we get or don't we get any kind of marine-based subsistence pattern, especially from the coastal region of Saurashtra during the Surat Harappan phase?
Oh, we do. We certainly do. We have a lot of molluscan shells of the phylum. The members belonging to that phylum. The bivalves and the other gastropods, medieval gastropods. These are actually found, and also a lot of fish remains in the form of vertebrae and also otoliths, which are also found from the classical Harappan sites. So the marine food resources certainly did play an important role in the food items of the Harappans, both probably Surat Harappans as well as the classical Harappans. Yes, certainly.
So she also asks, do we get some sort of difference between trade patterns with Kachchh region and Surat region, as we get more steatite seals from Dholavira, and from Lothal we get more terracotta seals and sealings?
Okay, quite complicated question. I'll kind of decongest it and say that regarding this steatite is actually not a material. So the classical, the Surat Harappans probably did not deal with the large scale bead production. We have seen that very minimal attempt to kind of make the beads of semi-precious stones. This steatite bead, in fact, is an interesting area of research. I suppose this is one of the beads which is found to be quite ubiquitous in most of the Harappan sites, which is also found from some of the Surat Harappan sites as well, suggesting that this must have been probably made by the classical Harappan. They must have been actually kind of exchanging it, with this, because of the interaction that existed between the two. You do actually come across these beads becoming part of their cultural assemblages. And the other question was actually about the seals. No, the terracotta. Sorry, the other part of the question.
Yes. So there is more steatite from Dholavira and more.
Steatites are actually found.
Sealings from Lothal.
Seals and sealings from Lothal. So is there any trade pattern that you can?
I think Prabhakar will be in a better position to answer this, the abundance of seals and sealings in Dholavira. I suppose they are equally abundant in Dholavira, seals and sealings, as much as in Lothal. Probably seals are more in...
Interestingly, from Dholavira, there are seals of different material. Like they have even made seals of kaolinite, not steatite.
Yeah.
So
there are interesting evidence actually coming from. So it would be actually kind of not properly right to say that Lothal has more seals and sealing and Dholavira has less. I suppose the data on that is actually not properly available. So once you get that data, probably we'll be in a better position to answer that.
So Professor Ajay Pratap has a follow-up question.
Yes.
He says, however, in comparison with other millet-based contemporaneous economies in the Vindhyan region, north and south, the material culture at Surat sites, they seem to be more affluent. Is this so? And how is this so?
Yeah, it's quite apparent that, the Surat Harappan sites are much more affluent than the sites which are actually depending upon millets in the Vindhyan region. This is primarily because, apart from the millets which they actually cultivated, because that was out of compulsion, because the environment did not actually support the proper agricultural activities dealing with the wheat and barley and winter crops, right? Whereas they did have technology and they were actually interacting with the classical Harappan. They were actually living in the same time. So they did actually participate in the economic activities or the economic growth of the Indus civilization. They were not actually a separate group. They were actually part of the urban Harappan growth. Only thing was that they did have certain regional features, and they did actually could not actually kind of cultivate wheat and barley. So that it is because of this exposure to these higher technologies and their interaction with the advanced economy that actually brought in the affluence which we actually talk about, the Surat Harappan. These are not available for people. I mean, those were actually kind of depending upon millet cultivation in the Vindhyan region. Probably that is the way one can actually kind of look at these evidence and then see how the process of cultural development. Yeah.
Okay. So there are many small questions, and I see that there are 2 or 3 questions from the same person, Tarun. So first, he asked, are there any Harappan sites in Gujarat without fortifications?
Yes, Tarun. Yes, there are. There are several rural settlements which, many of them do not have what we call a fortification or a perimeter wall. The perimeter walls are actually found in the slightly larger settlements. So I think more than 80% of the sites in Saurashtra, especially of the 500 sites, are of tiny rural settlements. They do not actually have a perimeter wall. It is not apparent when the surface features. Not all of them are actually excavated. Whatever small number of sites which are excavated, they do not have a perimeter wall. The perimeter walls are actually found in larger settlements invariably, whether it is Surat Harappan or the classical Harappan. The Surat Harappans is smaller in their features, whereas the classical Harappans were actually kind of quite large.
The 2 other questions are, I think the answers may be quite long, but maybe you can summarize them. So second one is, why is reserved slipware called reserved slipware, and how is faience prepared or made?
Okay, reserved slipware is called reserved slipware because the second slip, which is it's actually 2 slips which are applied on the same pot after the first slip which is applied is dried, and they do have 2 color variation. The first slip is generally found to be darker, the second is lighter. So the second slip is actually removed from the surface of the first slip in a reserved manner. That's the reason it has been actually named as a reserved. This is a tradition. Reserved slipware has actually been found in different antiquities in different places. It is actually found in the Amuk plain in the Mesopotamian region going back as early as 4000 BC. And then you have a similar kind of evidence actually coming from Balathal in our own country, in southern part of Rajasthan, where you have a kind of reserved slipware with the same technique, which is going to around 3600 BC. This is not, I suppose this is not unique to the Harappans, but what is unique to the Harappans is that the second slip, but the classical Harappans, the second slip appears to be a paste of fanes. When the fanes, in fact, is a synthetic material, which is actually a mixture of powdered quartz and an alkali, a base, which is actually added into it in order to reduce the melting point of the quartz powder. That's the technical explanation to it. How exactly this alkaline or the base was actually kind of prepared, several people have actually been trying to replicate this, and with mixed results many times. Yeah, you do. You can actually kind of replicate this by doing such experiments. So that is how this is actually produced. So you can actually make this paste into beads, or you can apply it on a figurine so that you are coating it, and then you actually kind of fire it in a kiln. So the surface actually kind of fused together to form the faint subject. That is how, simply explaining, this is how it is actually being produced. Yes. I hope I answered the question.
Very briefly, yes. I'll just ask one more question before I ask Michel to ask his 2 brief questions. So this one is, what kind of climatic change you have observed in the different regions of Gujarat in different micro and macro landscapes? Do you feel that the social resilience supported the population to sustain in the same region with small millet-based subsistence throughout different spatial temporal contexts?
Yeah, so it's a long question. Basically talking about whether we are actually able to understand the changes in the environment, how that is actually reflected in the cultural development. As we know that one of the reasons for the decline of Indus civilization has actually been attributed to the deterioration of the climate somewhere around 2000 BC, or what we call the Magellan effect, that is around 4,200 years from today, that is around 2,200 BC. That is exactly the time when the actual the decline, economic decline actually starts in the urban phase. But then from that time onwards, it is slow and steady decline. But then all the urban features started disappearing by 1900 BC. So there certainly was, climate certainly did impact the economic activities of the Harappans, which is pretty sure. But the degree of impact actually varied from region to region, from sometimes site to site. So different regions could actually kind of cope up with the changes differently, especially when you come to Gujarat. The Saurashtra, the urban centers are all kind of cannot actually kind of sustain their urban way of life. Whereas in the rural areas, like many of the Surat Harappan sites are rural areas, they did not actually disappear. The impact on them, their life was actually not as devastating as what we see in the urban centers. Though they continue to tick on with certain modifications and their adherence to what is known as the millets, which are quite drought resistant, probably did help them to kind of continue with this with the life with certain modifications, but not exactly the same way. That is the way one can actually visualize these things. So it certainly did vary from different region to region. But then, if you ask, did the micro level changes in the climate? I suppose those kind of very focused studies are yet to actually happen in many parts of Indus civilization, many sites of Indus civilization, micro level. What we are essentially talking about in a macro level. Yeah.
So I seem to have missed one question in the Q&A box, the last one, before I hand it over to Michel. Hasmukh Seth, he asks, as you said, you have been working on graffitis from Gujarat Harappan sites. Is there any evidence of actual Harappan signs, or these are just random marks and streaks?
When you say actual Harappan sites, means the Harappan character, I mean the script characters being.
Yes.
Yeah, there are. That is often considered to be an evidence of the influence of the classical Harappans in Surat. Like the tragedy has a portrait with the I think 4 or 5 characters inscribed on in the Harappan script. These are actually found from Surat. Yeah, I have just started looking at the humongous number of graffiti which you come across primarily on Surat Harappans. I firmly believe that in the Surat Harappans probably did communicate through this graffiti, because you do actually come across certain common features coming up in those graffiti, in spite of they being sites being located quite far off places. So one need to kind of codify these things, kind of collect these things, and then trying to kind of classify them and see what pattern it emerges, what significance it actually holds to understand the status of Surat Harappans in terms of their communication through those little signs which you see on portraits.
Okay, Michelle, you said that you had two small questions.
I will limit myself to just one question, and maybe you can answer briefly. You know, there is this old Nal Sarovar connecting link hypothesis, which would have connected in Harappan times the Run of Kachchh with the Gulf of Kambat. So that Dholavira and Lothal, for example, would have had a direct navigation link through this channel, if it was a channel, rather than having to go around the whole coast of Saurashtra. Have you found anything that could, in the archaeological record, that could point to some support for this hypothesis?
I think two things. First thing is that I think there were a series of surveys which has been actually conducted along the North Sarovar, leading towards the north, towards the the Run of Kachchh, little Run of Kachchh. That's what you were actually mentioning, and also towards Lothal. They did actually come across a few sites, very rural kind of sites along that, but nothing very substantial to suggest that this could have been a major kind of transitory route between the northern part of Gujarat or the Kachch and Saurashtra. And also there are, if I remember correctly, there are studies carried out by the geologists. They did actually come across some evidence of marine aggression in the form of sediments in that region. But then they are all actually dated many thousands of years much earlier than the Harappan civilization was there. They are almost all of them are in the Pleistocene. All those evidence actually dates back to the Pleistocene, not to the Holocene. So the Harappans comes in the later half of the Holocene. So if at all it was connected, those connections appears to have existed geologically prior to the Holocene. So there will be a lot of contradictions in that way regarding this as a viable kind of pathway. And it's not really supported by the archaeological evidence as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it is late and probably time to thank you very much for a wonderful talk. You will see a lot of appreciation in the chat box, and it was extraordinarily detailed, and it made us understand very, very well these regional interactions. My other question, in fact, had to do with this term colonization, which was one used, to indicate the spread of the Harappans. But you have kind of answered it by speaking of Harappan expansion. You did not speak of colonization.
No, I did not use. I don't think that way. So I will not be actually using the term colonization.
But quite a few people were using it, even the late Dr. Dhavalikar, for example.
Probably not understanding, probably not appreciating the implications of it,
Yes.
I mean, this is my guess. I cannot actually comment on how exactly Professor Dhavalikar actually used it. So it has its own implications. Probably that is not the way one actually understand the cultural expansion.
But thank you for making us realize how early it begins.
Yeah.
And long before the actual Harappan urban or mature phase. So that was so important. So Prabhakar, any concluding words?
No, thank you so much, Professor Ajithprasad, for this wonderful lecture and sparing your valuable time. And we hope to have much more interactions with you in the near future. And thank you once again. And thanks to all the participants who have logged in and listened to this wonderful talk. And I hope to see you again in the next one. Thank you.
I thank you, all of you, the organizers as well as the participants, and also I have to apologize for the unanticipated interruptions in the net, which actually
no need to apologize for that. It happens. I mean,
yeah, sorry. Thank you, and then
thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.